I never imagined that the hands that once changed his diapers would one day pack my belongings like unwanted clutter. At 58, I thought I had earned the right to feel safe in my own home, the home I had worked 3 jobs to help him buy, the home where I had cooked thousands of meals, where I had waited up countless nights when he was young and reckless, praying he would come home safely. But that Tuesday morning, as I placed his favorite scrambled eggs on the kitchen table, extra cheese, just how he liked them since he was 7 years old, my son Lucas handed me an envelope with the same casual indifference he might show when passing me the salt. "Pack a bag, Mom," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "You have 12 hours. My hands trembled as I opened that envelope. Inside was a legal document that might as well have been my death certificate. Eviction notice. My name, crossed out. My life, reduced to legal terminology and deadlines. 40 years of motherhood, dismissed with a signature I had never seen before. The eggs grew cold on the plate as I read those words over and over, hoping somehow they would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Something that didn't destroy everything I thought I knew about love and family, and the promises we make to each other when we bring children into this world. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of my own heart breaking. "I don't understand. This is my home too. We bought this house together, remember? With my inheritance from your grandmother. With my savings from working double shifts at the diner for 15 years. He finally looked up, and in his eyes I saw something that chilled me more than any winter morning. Complete absence of warmth, of recognition, of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, asking me to chase away the monsters under his bed. "Things change," he said with a shrug that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Maria is pregnant. We need the space. You understand. Maria." His girlfriend of 8 months, who had never worked a day in her life, who treated me like an inconvenient piece of furniture that cluttered their modern love story. Maria, who was now carrying my grandchild. A grandchild I apparently wouldn't be welcome to know. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. I had given Lucas everything. When his father walked out on us when Lucas was 12, I didn't have time to fall apart. I worked morning shifts at the diner, afternoon shifts at the laundromat, and weekend shifts cleaning offices so he could have the soccer cleats he wanted, the video games his friends had, the college education that would give him opportunities I never had. I postponed my own dreams so completely that I forgot I had ever had any. The nursing degree I had been pursuing when I got pregnant. Abandoned. The small business I had always wanted to start. Forgotten. The trips I had planned to take, the books I had wanted to write, the life I had imagined for myself, all sacrificed on the altar of his needs, his future, his happiness. When he graduated college, I was so proud I cried for 3 days. My son, the first in our family to earn a degree, walking across that stage in his cap and gown while I sat in the audience wearing a dress I had bought at a thrift store because every extra dollar had gone toward his education. When he got his first job in marketing, making more money in a month than I made in 3, I thought finally, my sacrifices would mean something. I thought he would see what I had done for him, how I had shaped my entire existence around his success. Instead, he moved Maria in 6 months later, and suddenly everything I did was wrong. The way I cooked was too simple for their sophisticated palates. The way I watched television was too loud. The way I laughed was too boisterous. My presence, once the center of his world, became an embarrassment he needed to manage. "You're getting older, Mom," he told me one evening when I asked why he seemed so distant. "Maybe it's time you thought about what you want to do with your life instead of hovering around mine." Hovering. As if 26 years of devotion could be reduced to such a dismissive word. I had watched him transform from the grateful young man who hugged me at graduation into someone I barely recognized. Someone who spoke to me like I was a burden he had inherited, rather than the woman who had given him everything she had. The house felt different with Maria living there. My kitchen became her kitchen. My living room became their living room. My son became her son, nodding along when she made comments about how I needed to find my own path, and stop depending on them for my happiness. Depending on them. As if I hadn't been the one paying half the mortgage with my diner wages. As if I hadn't been the one buying groceries and cooking meals they were too busy to prepare. As if I hadn't been the one who turned this house into a home while they lived their glamorous life. But I had stayed quiet, believing that love meant accommodation, that being a good mother meant making space for his new life, even when that space seemed to be shrinking around me like a slowly closing fist. Now, standing in the kitchen that had been my sanctuary for 5 years, staring at legal papers that erased my existence with the stroke of a pen, I realized that my silence had been mistaken for weakness, my love interpreted as dependency, my sacrifices forgotten like yesterday's newspaper. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Lucas was already walking away, his attention returned to his phone. "That's not really my problem anymore, is it?" And in that moment, I understood that the child I had raised, the man I had shaped with every choice I made for 26 years, had just told me that my life, my very existence, was no longer his concern. The eggs were still sitting on the table, cold and forgotten, just like me. 12 hours. It seemed impossible that an entire life could be dismantled in 12 hours. But I learned that morning how quickly love can transform into logistics, how rapidly a home becomes just another address you used to know. I started with my bedroom, the room where I had cried myself to sleep after Lucas's father left, where I had planned birthday parties and Christmas mornings, where I had folded tiny clothes and dreamed about my son's future. Now I was sorting through decades of memories, deciding what could fit in 2 suitcases and what would be abandoned forever. The photo albums were the hardest. Page after page of Lucas growing up. First steps, first day of school, graduation day. In every picture, I was there beside him, smiling with the fierce pride of a woman who had found her purpose in someone else's success. But as I flipped through those pages, I began to notice something that chilled me. In the more recent photos, my smile looked strained, almost apologetic, as if I was asking permission to exist in my own son's life. When had that happened? When had I stopped being his mother and become his obligation? I heard voices from the kitchen, Lucas and Maria discussing their plans for my room with the casual efficiency of people redesigning a space after removing unwanted furniture. Maria's voice carried clearly. "We could turn it into a nursery, paint it yellow, maybe add some built-in shelving. It gets great morning light." My room, the room where I had rocked Lucas to sleep when he was colicky, where I had nursed him through fevers and nightmares, where I had sewn Halloween costumes by hand because store-bought ones were beyond our budget. It was being transformed into someone else's sanctuary before I had even finished packing my belongings. "What about her stuff?" Lucas asked, and for a moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe he was having second thoughts. Maybe the son I had raised was still in there somewhere, buried beneath this stranger's cruelty. "Storage unit, I guess," Maria replied dismissively. "Or donation. Most of it looks pretty old anyway." Pretty old. 40 years of careful accumulation, of choosing each item with love and intention, dismissed as clutter that needed disposing. I continued packing in silence, my hands moving automatically while my mind struggled to process this new reality. The quilt my mother had made for my wedding, folded carefully into the larger suitcase. The jewelry box Lucas had given me for Mother's Day when he was 16, bought with money from his first job, wrapped in tissue paper. The books I had collected over the years, each one a small rebellion against the exhaustion that usually claimed my evenings. I could only take 3. As I worked, I could hear them making phone calls. Maria was calling her mother, excitedly describing their plans for the nursery. "Yes, we finally got the space we needed," she said, laughing at something her mother said in response. "It was time for some changes around here." Lucas was on the phone with someone from work, discussing whether he could take a long lunch to handle some family stuff. Family stuff. That's what I had become. A problem to be resolved during his lunch break. The cruelest part wasn't the eviction itself, though that was devastating enough. It was the casual indifference with which they discussed my erasure from their lives, as if I were a temporary inconvenience rather than the woman who had made their life together possible. I remembered Maria's arrival 8 months ago, how I had tried so hard to make her feel welcome. I had cooked her favorite meals, learned about her interests, bought little gifts to show her I was happy she made Lucas smile. I had genuinely believed we could build some kind of relationship, that she might even become the daughter I had never had. But Maria had other ideas. Within weeks, she was suggesting that perhaps I spent too much time in the common areas, that maybe I should consider getting my own place so they could have more privacy. She framed these suggestions as concern for my independence, but I understood the real message. I was in the way of the life she wanted to build with my son, and Lucas, instead of defending the woman who had raised him, had nodded along with her suggestions, gradually treating me more like an intrusive roommate than his mother. He stopped asking about my day, stopped including me in conversations about their plans, stopped seeing me as a person with feelings that mattered. The morning Maria announced her pregnancy 3 weeks ago, I had been genuinely happy for them. I had imagined babysitting, teaching my grandchild to cook, passing down family stories and traditions. I had foolishly believed that becoming a grandmother would strengthen my place in their lives, give me a new purpose that would matter to them. Instead, the pregnancy had become the final justification for my removal. They needed space. They needed privacy. They needed to start fresh, without the complications of the past, meaning me cluttering their new beginning. I found Lucas in the hallway, carrying boxes to the garage. For a moment, we stood facing each other in the narrow space where I had once hung his school pictures, where a height chart on the wall still marked his growth from age 5 to 18. "Lucas?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Please help me understand this. What did I do wrong? What could I have done differently?" He set down the boxes and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Part annoyance, part something that might have been guilt. "It's not about right or wrong, Mom. It's about moving forward. You can't live here forever, depending on us for everything." "Depending on you?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "I pay half the mortgage. I buy the groceries. I clean this house, cook your meals, manage the maintenance calls when things break. How exactly am I depending on you?" "It's not just about money," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he wanted to end an argument without actually addressing it. "It's about boundaries. Healthy boundaries. Boundaries." Another word that sounded clinical and reasonable but felt like a knife between my ribs. "When you were 12 and your father left us," I said quietly, "did I need boundaries then? When I worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on your back, were those healthy boundaries? When I gave up my education, my dreams, my entire life to make sure you had opportunities, were those the wrong kind of boundaries?" His jaw tightened, and I saw a flicker of the old Lucas, the one who used to hug me when I came home exhausted from work, who used to tell me I was the best mom in Daraway, the world. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "That was your choice," he said finally. "No one asked you to sacrifice everything. That was your decision. My decision." As if being a single mother at 22, abandoned and terrified, had offered me a menu of choices rather than forcing me into survival mode. As if love itself wasn't a decision made new every single day for 26 years. I looked at this man, my son, my life's work, my greatest achievement, and realized that I had raised a stranger. Somewhere along the way, the grateful child had become an entitled adult who viewed my sacrifices not as love, but as his natural due. "You're right," I said softly. "It was my choice, and now you're making yours." The hours crawled by like wounded animals, each minute stretching longer than the last as I methodically erased myself from the only home I had known in 5 years. By noon, my entire existence had been reduced to 2 overstuffed suitcases and a cardboard box containing items too precious to leave behind, but too fragile to survive rough handling. I sat in the living room one final time, surrounded by the ghosts of furniture that had defined our family life. The couch where Lucas and I used to watch movies on Sunday afternoons was gone, sold online 3 days ago without anyone bothering to tell me. The coffee table where we had played board games during his teenage years had disappeared sometime last week. Even the family photos that had lined the mantelpiece had vanished, replaced by minimalist decorations that spoke of a life I had never been invited to join. Maria emerged from what used to be my bedroom, now holding paint swatches and measuring tape. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to claim it, discussing color schemes and furniture placement with the decorator she had called without consulting anyone. "The pale yellow will be perfect," she said into her phone, her voice bright with excitement. "And we'll need the crib delivered by next week. Yes, the room will be completely ready by then." She glanced at me, sitting among my packed belongings, and offered what might have been meant as a sympathetic smile. "You know, Alessandra, this might actually be a blessing in disguise. You've been taking care of other people for so long. Maybe it's time you learned to take care of yourself." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Taking care of myself, as if the 26 years I had spent devoted to my son's well-being had been some kind of character flaw rather than the deepest expression of love I knew how to give. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the sound of contractors she had called to start renovations before I had even left the building. Maria shrugged with the thoughtless ease of someone who had never faced homelessness, who had never wondered where her next meal would come from, or whether she would have a roof over her head at nightfall. "There must be apartments you can afford. Maybe something smaller, more suitable for someone in your situation." My situation. Single, 58, with limited savings and no real prospects for employment that would pay enough to afford housing in a city where rents had doubled in the past 5 years. My situation was exactly what it appeared to be: desperation disguised as a life transition. Lucas returned from whatever errands had kept him away all morning, carrying coffee for himself and Maria, but nothing for me. It was such a small oversight, but it felt enormous in that moment. Evidence that I had already been erased from his consideration so completely that basic courtesy no longer applied. "How's the packing going?" he asked, directing the question to my suitcases rather than to me. "I'm finished," I said, though finishing implied completion rather than abandonment. "Could you help me understand how the finances will work? The mortgage, the utilities, the insurance? We've been splitting those costs for 5 years. That's all handled," he said dismissively, checking his phone rather than meeting my eyes. "Maria and I have it covered. But I've been paying? You've been contributing," he corrected, the distinction apparently meaningful to him, though it felt like semantics to me. "Now you won't need to worry about it anymore." Contributing. As if my money had been some kind of charitable donation, rather than my equal share of our joint responsibilities. As if the years I had spent helping to build equity in this house had been a favor I was doing them, rather than an investment in what I had foolishly believed was our shared future. "What about my equity?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that was slowly consuming everything I thought I knew about my life. Lucas and Maria exchanged a look. One of those wordless communications that couples develop when they need to present a united front against outside interference. I realized with sickening clarity that I had become the outside interference in my own son's life. "What equity?" Maria asked with genuine confusion, as if the concept of my financial contribution was entirely foreign to her understanding of our arrangement. "The down payment," I said, my voice growing stronger as I fought to reclaim some sense of reality in a conversation that felt like it was happening underwater. "I contributed $30,000 from my mother's life insurance money. That's part of my investment in this house." "That was a gift," Lucas said firmly, his tone suggesting that this conversation was closed before it had really begun. "You gave us that money as a gift when we bought the house. There's no equity involved." A gift. $30,000. Everything I had inherited from my mother. Every penny she had saved working as a seamstress for 40 years, reframed as generosity rather than investment. I remembered the conversation differently. Remembered discussing how my contribution would give me security, how we would be building something together that would benefit all of us. But memories, I was learning, could be edited by people who found the original version inconvenient for their current narrative. "I have the bank documents," I said weakly. Though even as I spoke, I realized that documents mean nothing when the people you trust decide to reinterpret their meaning. "You have documents showing you gave us money," Lucas clarified with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "That's not the same thing as ownership." I looked at my son, This man I had created, nurtured, shaped with every decision I had made for nearly 3 decades, and saw a stranger who spoke my language but lived in a completely different moral universe. In his world, my sacrifices were gifts that created no obligations. My contributions were donations that established no rights. My love was a service that could be terminated when it was no longer needed. "When did I become so dispensable to you?" I asked, the question emerging from some deep place I hadn't known existed. For just a moment, his expression softened, and I saw a flicker of the boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was sad, who used to tell me I was his best friend in the whole world. "You're not dispensable, Mom," he said quietly. It's time for both of us to have our own lives." But I had never stopped him from having his own life. I had encouraged every dream, supported every goal, celebrated every achievement as if it were my own. The only life I had given up was mine, and apparently that had been the problem all along. Maria's phone rang, interrupting the moment with a cheerful ringtone that seemed obscenely upbeat given the circumstances. She answered with the bright voice she reserved for people who mattered to her future. "Oh, hi, sweetie," she said, walking toward the kitchen. "Yes, we're just finishing up here. She'll be gone by tonight, and then we can start setting up the nursery properly." She'll be gone by tonight. Not Alessandra, not Lucas's mother, not the woman who had made their life together possible. Just she, a pronoun that reduced me to a problem that would soon be solved. I stood up, my joints stiff from sitting too long in the same position, and looked around the room one final time. This had been my home, my sanctuary, my investment in a future I had believed would include me. Now it was just a place I used to live, full of strangers who happened to share my DNA and my history, but none of my understanding of what family was supposed to mean. The afternoon sun streamed through windows I had cleaned countless times, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts of the life I was leaving behind. By 5 o'clock, I was standing on the sidewalk outside the house that had been my home, holding 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, while watching Lucas load the last of what he considered my things into his car. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was driving me away from the life we had built together in the same car I had helped him buy for his graduation present. The neighbors pretended not to notice the domestic drama unfolding in their pristine suburban landscape. Mrs. Chen from next door suddenly became very interested in her rose bushes. The Johnsons across the street found urgent reasons to rearrange items in their garage. These were people who had known me for 5 years, who had borrowed cups of sugar and accepted packages when they weren't home, who had exchanged pleasantries about weather and weekend plans. Now they averted their eyes as if homelessness might be contagious. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked Lucas one final time as he closed the trunk with the finality of a coffin lid. "There's a motel about 10 miles down Highway 6, he said, consulting his phone rather than looking at me. "It's not expensive. You can stay there while you figure things out." A motel. After 26 years of devotion, my future had been reduced to a nightly rate at a roadside inn where strangers came and went without leaving traces of their existence. "For how long?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be insufficient. He shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing weather patterns rather than his mother's survival. "However long it takes, I guess." "However long what takes?" I wanted to ask. "However long it takes for me to find an apartment I can't afford with money I don't have. However long it takes for employers to hire a 58-year-old woman with limited skills and a decades-old resume. However long it takes for you to feel guilty enough to remember that I'm still your mother." But I didn't ask those questions, because I already understood that my practical problems were no longer his concern. I had been reclassified from family member to former resident, and former residents were expected to solve their own problems without bothering the current occupants. The ride to the motel passed in silence, broken only by the GPS directions from his phone and the soft jazz station he preferred. Music that had once seemed sophisticated, but now felt like an insult to the gravity of what was happening. He drove carefully, observing all traffic laws, checking his mirrors regularly. The same responsible behavior he had learned from me during those long hours I had spent teaching him to drive when he was 16. I remembered those driving lessons with painful clarity. How proud I had been of his quick reflexes, his attention to detail, his natural caution behind the wheel. I had imagined then that I was preparing him for independence, teaching him skills that would keep him safe in a dangerous world. I had never imagined I was training him to drive me away from everything we had built together. The Sunset Motel lived up to neither part of its name. There was no sunset visible from its location beneath a highway overpass, and it bore little resemblance to anything that could reasonably be called a motel, rather than a last resort for people who had run out of better options. The parking lot was cracked asphalt populated by cars that looked like they had been abandoned rather than parked. The neon sign flickered erratically, creating a strobe effect that made the entire place seem unstable, impermanent, designed for people passing through rather than anyone planning to stay. Lucas waited in the car while I checked in, his engine running as if he might need to make a quick escape. The desk clerk was a tired-looking woman about my age who processed my credit card transaction with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had seen too many people arrive with everything they owned packed into suitcases. "Weekly rates are cheaper if you're planning to stay more than a few days," she offered without making eye contact. The kind of practical advice that comes from experience with people who couldn't afford better options. Weekly rates. The phrase hung in the air like a prophecy I didn't want to acknowledge. How had my life contracted to the point where weekly motel rates represented a reasonable financial strategy? Room 237 was on the second floor, accessible via an external staircase that creaked under my weight and vibrated with each passing truck on the highway above. The room itself was small, clean enough to be habitable, furnished with the kind of aggressively neutral decor that was designed to offend no one while comforting no one either. 2 double beds dominated the space, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would need 2 beds in such a small room unless they were planning to share the space with someone they couldn't bear to touch. A small table by the window held a lamp with a shade that had been repaired with tape. The carpet showed traffic patterns from countless previous occupants, paths worn into the fibers by people who had paced these same routes while trying to figure out how their lives had gone so wrong. I set my suitcases on one bed and the cardboard box on the other, then sat in the single chair and tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. This morning, I had been a woman with a home, a family, a sense of belonging in the world. Tonight, I was a motel resident with nowhere to go, and no one who cared whether I survived the transition. The silence was overwhelming. For 5 years, I had lived with the constant background noise of other people's lives. Lucas's conference calls, Maria's music, the television shows they watched together in the evenings while I cleaned up after dinner or folded laundry in my room. Now there was nothing but the highway noise and the occasional sound of other motel residents coming and going with their own desperate stories. I opened my purse and counted my money with the careful attention of someone for whom every dollar had suddenly become crucial. $347 in cash, plus whatever remained on the credit card I had used for the room. My checking account had maybe $800, money I had been saving for Christmas presents and small emergencies. I had never imagined that becoming homeless qualified as a small emergency. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. The motel room cost $60 per night, which meant my cash would last less than a week, even if I ate nothing and bought nothing else. The weekly rate the clerk had mentioned was $350, which would consume my entire savings and leave me with nothing for food or other necessities. I needed a job immediately, but finding employment at 58 with a resume that hadn't been updated in decades would be challenging under the best circumstances. These were not the best circumstances. These were the circumstances of a woman who no longer had an address, a phone number that would remain stable, or appropriate clothing for job interviews. The cardboard box on the bed next to me contained the few photographs Lucas had allowed me to take, pictures of him at various ages, documentation of a childhood that had apparently meant more to me than to him. I opened the box and pulled out my favorite photo, Lucas at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing he had made for Mother's Day. The drawing showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with "I love you, Mom," written in crayon letters that sprawled across the page. I stared at that little boy's face and tried to find him in the man who had driven me to this motel room. When had love become obligation? When had gratitude transformed into resentment? When had the child who promised to take care of me when I got old decided that old age was a burden he wasn't willing to shoulder? Outside my window, the traffic never stopped. Cars and trucks passed beneath the overpass in an endless stream, their occupants traveling toward destinations that mattered to them, toward homes where people waited for their return. I watched those lights disappear into the distance and wondered if I would ever again have a place where someone was glad to see me arrive. The phone in my room rang once, startling me from my thoughts. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe Lucas was calling to apologize, to say he had made a terrible mistake, to ask me to come home. But it was just the front desk, confirming my checkout time for tomorrow. Tomorrow. I had less than 18 hours to figure out how to rebuild a life that had taken 58 years to construct. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something they didn't know existed, something that might change everything. I spent that first night in the motel staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the symphony of strangers living their own desperate stories through paper-thin walls. But somewhere between the sound of a crying baby in the next room and the argument happening 2 doors down, something inside me shifted. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile for what I was experiencing. It was something harder, more durable. It was decision. By morning, I had stopped crying, not because the pain had lessened, but because tears were a luxury I could no longer afford. I needed clarity, and grief clouded everything. I needed to think, and emotion made thinking impossible. Most importantly, I needed to remember who I had been before I became defined entirely by my relationship to Lucas. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my old address book, the physical kind that people my age still kept, and began making a list of names I hadn't contacted in years. Friends from my waitressing days, neighbors from the apartment where Lucas and I had lived when he was small, co-workers from the various jobs I had held before my life became entirely consumed by his needs. Most of these relationships had withered through neglect. When Lucas started high school and needed more of my attention, I had gradually stopped accepting invitations to movies or dinners with friends. When he went to college and my financial resources became entirely devoted to his education, I had stopped making plans that cost money. When he graduated and moved back home, I had convinced myself that rebuilding my social life could wait until he was more settled in his career. I had been waiting for permission to have my own life for so long that I had forgotten I didn't need anyone's permission. The first name on my list was Elena Rodriguez, a woman I had worked with at the diner 15 years ago. Elena had always been the type of person who remembered birthdays, who checked on people when they were going through difficult times, who maintained connections even when geography and circumstances made them challenging to sustain. I found her number and called before I could lose my nerve. Alessandra? Elena's voice was warm with surprise and genuine pleasure. My goodness, it's been forever. How are you? How's that son of yours? The question hit harder than I had expected. How was my son? He was successfully eliminating me from his life with the efficiency of someone deleting unwanted files from a computer. But I couldn't say that. Not yet. He's doing well, I said instead, which wasn't exactly a lie. Actually, I'm calling because I'm going through some changes in my life, and I wondered if we could meet for coffee. Catch up properly. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a small cafe Elena recommended, a place that apparently had reasonable prices and excellent coffee. As I hung up the phone, I realized how strange it felt to make plans that were entirely about what I wanted rather than what someone else needed from me. The rest of the morning I spent walking around the neighborhood near the motel, getting familiar with the bus routes and commercial establishments that would need to sustain me while I figured out my next steps. It wasn't a wealthy area. Most of the businesses were designed to serve people with limited resources, but it was also a place where nobody would judge me for paying in small bills or ask questions about why I was staying at a motel. I found a library branch about 6 blocks away, housed in a building that had obviously been constructed during a more optimistic era when communities invested in public spaces without requiring them to generate profit. The librarian was a young man with kind eyes who explained their policies about computer use and internet access with the patience of someone who understood that public libraries served as lifelines for people navigating difficult circumstances. We also have job search resources, he offered without my asking. Resume templates, interview preparation materials, lists of employers who are actively hiring, and all of our services are completely free. Free. The word had never sounded so beautiful. I spent 2 hours at one of their computers, updating my resume for the first time in decades. It was a humbling exercise, trying to translate 26 years of motherhood into language that employers might find valuable. But as I worked, I began to see patterns I had never noticed before. Managing a household budget during years of financial uncertainty, that was financial management experience. Coordinating Lucas's education, healthcare, and social activities while working multiple jobs, that was project management and organizational skills. Dealing with his teachers, coaches, and the various authorities who shaped his childhood, that was communication and advocacy experience. I had spent so many years thinking of myself as just a mother that I had never recognized the extensive skill set that effective mothering required. I wasn't just a woman with no experience. I was a woman whose experience had been so deeply undervalued that even I had stopped recognizing its worth. The meeting with Elena went better than I had dared to hope. She looked older, of course. We both did. But her energy was the same warm, enveloping presence I remembered. She listened without judgment as I told her an edited version of my story, focusing on my desire for independence rather than the circumstances that had forced it upon me. "You know," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the thoughtful attention of someone considering possibilities, "my daughter Carmen has been looking for someone to help with her consulting business. Nothing fancy, mostly administrative support, managing her calendar, handling client communications. But she's been growing steadily and needs someone reliable who can learn quickly. I don't have much experience with office work," I admitted, though even as I said it, I realized how limiting that statement was. "Experience can be learned," Elena said firmly. "Character can't be taught. And I remember what kind of person you are, Alessandra. You're the type who shows up early, stays late, and does whatever needs to be done without complaining about it." That evening, back in my motel room, I opened the cardboard box again and pulled out something I hadn't looked at in years. A letter from my mother, written shortly before she died. I had read it once, at her funeral, and then packed it away because the grief had been too overwhelming to process. Now, with the perspective that comes from experiencing your own form of abandonment, I read her words differently. "My dearest Alessandra," the letter began in her careful handwriting, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are dealing with all the practical things that death leaves behind. But I want you to know something that I never told you while I was alive, because I was afraid it might complicate your relationship with your father." I paused, confused. My father had died when I was 12. What could possibly complicate a relationship with someone who had been gone for over 40 years? "The house on Maple Street, the one where you grew up, the one your father and I bought when you were a baby. I never sold it after he died. I know I told you I had to sell it to pay medical bills, but that wasn't true. I rented it out and used the income to help support us. I was afraid that if you knew about it, you might feel obligated to help manage it when you already had so much responsibility with Lucas." My hands trembled as I continued reading. "The house is yours now, along with everything else. Mr. Patterson at First National Bank has all the paperwork. The tenant's lease expires at the end of this year, which means you can decide what you want to do with the property. I know it's not much, but it's something. It's yours, and no one can take it away from you." I set the letter down and stared at the motel room wall, trying to process what I had just learned. Somewhere across town, in the neighborhood where I had grown up, there was a house that belonged to me, a house I had thought was lost forever, sold to pay for the medical expenses that had consumed my mother's final years, a house that Lucas knew nothing about. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Not because my problems were solved, they weren't, but because I had just remembered something important about myself. I was not just Lucas's discarded mother. I was Alessandra Morrison, daughter of people who had worked hard and saved carefully, and left me something that could not be taken away by ungrateful children or their calculating girlfriends. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And sometimes, having something that belongs only to you is enough to remind you that you still exist as a person, separate from the ways other people have failed to value you. The next morning, I would call Mr. Patterson at the bank. I would find out exactly what my mother had left me, and I would begin the process of reclaiming not just property, but my sense of myself as someone who deserved to take up space in the world. But tonight, I fell asleep holding my mother's letter, feeling for the first time in months that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. The dead, it turned out, could be more loyal than the living. Mr. Patterson had the kind of gentle, methodical manner that comes from spending decades helping people navigate the complex aftermath of loss. His office at First National Bank was lined with certificates and family photos, the walls of someone who understood that financial transactions often carried profound emotional weight. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said, pulling a thick folder from his filing cabinet. "Very organized, very forward-thinking. She made sure everything was properly documented and legally sound." As he spread the papers across his desk, I began to understand the full scope of what my mother had quietly accomplished during the years I thought she was struggling to survive on Social Security and a small pension. The house on Maple Street wasn't just mine. It was completely paid off, with property taxes current through the end of the year. The rental income from the tenants had been automatically deposited into an account I didn't know existed, accumulating for over 3 years since my mother's death. The total was enough to make me sit back in my chair and recalculate everything I thought I knew about my financial situation. "She left specific instructions," Mr. Patterson continued, consulting a handwritten note clipped to the inside of the folder. "The tenant's lease expires December 31st. They've been good tenants, always paid on time, took excellent care of the property. But your mother wanted you to have the option of moving in yourself if circumstances ever made that necessary." Circumstances. It was such a diplomatic way to describe having your life destroyed by people you trusted. "There's also this," he said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in my mother's familiar script. "She asked me to give this to you when you came to claim the property." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, aware that Mr. Patterson was politely pretending to organize other papers, while I read what felt like a message from beyond the grave. "My darling daughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered my little secret. I hope you will forgive me for not telling you about the house while I was alive, but I knew you would have insisted on helping manage it when you already had so much on your plate with Lucas. I rented it to the Hendersons because they reminded me of us when you were young. A young family trying to make ends meet, needing a safe place to raise their children. They have been wonderful tenants, but I always planned for you to have the house back when you needed it. I suspect that time may come sooner than either of us would like. I have watched you give everything to Lucas, and while I admire your devotion, I worry about what will happen when he no longer needs you in the same way. Children grow up, darling. They build their own lives. And sometimes in doing so, they forget that their mothers are more than just the people who raised them. This house is not just property. It is independence. It is the freedom to make choices based on what you want rather than what others will tolerate. It is proof that you come from people who planned ahead, who worked hard, who believed you deserved security even when you might not believe it yourself. The Hendersons' lease expires at the end of this year, but they would like to buy the house if you are willing to sell. I have included their contact information. They are good people, and they would pay a fair price. But the choice is yours, and yours alone. Remember, my darling, you are not defined by other people's capacity to appreciate you. You are my daughter, and you carry within you the strength of generations of women who survived difficult circumstances and emerged with their dignity intact. All my love, always. Mama. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my purse, aware that Mr. Patterson was waiting patiently for me to process this information. "The Hendersons have indeed inquired about purchasing," he said gently. "The market in that neighborhood has improved significantly since your mother bought the house. Based on recent sales, the property is worth approximately $250,000. $250,000. The number hung in the air like a mathematical impossibility. 3 days ago, I had been counting my remaining cash in dollars. Now I was being told I owned an asset worth more than Lucas made in 4 years. But more than the money, though the money was certainly important, there was something else. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had options. Real options. Not the desperate scrambling of someone with no alternatives. I could sell the house and use the money to establish a new life somewhere far from Lucas and Maria and their casual cruelty. I could keep the house and move back to the neighborhood where I had grown up, where I still had roots and memories that belonged only to me. I could do something else entirely, something I hadn't even thought of yet. The power to choose was intoxicating after weeks of having choices made for me by people who viewed my preferences as irrelevant inconveniences. "I'd like to see the house," I said finally, "and meet the Hendersons, if they're available." "Of course," Mr. Patterson said, making a note in his calendar. "I'll arrange a meeting for tomorrow morning, if that works for you." That evening, I called Elena to share an edited version of my good news. I couldn't explain the full situation without revealing more about my circumstances than I was ready to discuss, but I could tell her that a family property had become available, and I was considering my options. "That's wonderful," she said warmly. "And speaking of opportunities, I talked to Carmen about the administrative position. She'd like to meet with you next week if you're interested." Two possibilities, emerging simultaneously after weeks of seeing nothing but closed doors and dead ends. It felt like the universe was offering me a chance to rebuild, but on my own terms this time. I spent that night making lists, not the desperate inventories of survival I had been creating, but actual plans. If I sold the house, what kind of life could I build with that money? If I kept the house, how would I furnish it and make it feel like home again? If I took the job with Carmen, how would I structure my days to include work that mattered to me rather than just tasks that needed to be completed? For the first time in years, I was thinking about what I wanted rather than what other people expected from me. The next morning, I took a bus to Maple Street and stood across from the house where I had learned to ride a bicycle, where I had waited for the school bus, where I had brought Lucas as a baby to visit his grandmother. The Hendersons had maintained it beautifully: fresh paint, well-tended garden, new shutters that somehow managed to look both modern and respectful of the home's original character. Mrs. Henderson answered the door with a baby on her hip and paint in her hair, the harried but content look of someone in the middle of a home improvement project. When I introduced myself, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "You're Margaret's daughter. Oh my goodness, we've heard so much about you. Please come in. Excuse the mess. We're painting the nursery." The house was exactly as I remembered it, but filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Children's toys scattered across the living room floor, artwork hung on the refrigerator, the accumulated artifacts of people who had made this house into their home. "We love this place so much," Mrs. Henderson said, settling the baby into a high chair and offering me coffee. When Mr. Patterson told us it might be available for purchase, we could hardly believe it. We've been saving for years, hoping we might be able to buy it someday. I looked around the kitchen where my mother had taught me to cook, where I had done homework at the table that was now covered with the Hendersons' mail and bills and school notices. This family had created the same kind of warmth and security here that my parents had provided for me. "How much were you hoping to offer?" I asked, though I already knew from Mr. Patterson what the house was worth. "We could go as high as $230,000, she said nervously. "I know that's probably not market value, but it's everything we have saved, plus what we could get approved for a mortgage." It was $20,000 less than market value, but watching this young mother worry about whether she could afford to keep her family in the home they had made their own reminded me of my mother's words. Sometimes the right choice isn't the most profitable choice. "Let me think about it," I said, though I was already beginning to understand what my decision would be. That afternoon I called Lucas, not to beg or to explain or to try to repair the irreparable damage he had done to our relationship. I called to inform him of something he needed to know, in the same dispassionate tone he had used when delivering my eviction notice. "There are some legal documents you should be aware of," I said when he answered, clearly annoyed by the interruption to whatever he was doing. "What kind of documents?" "Regarding my financial situation. I'll be sending copies to your address, since that's still my official mailing address until I make other arrangements." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him trying to figure out whether this was some kind of manipulation, some desperate attempt to guilt him into reconsidering his decision. "What financial situation?" he asked finally. "Property inheritance. It's complicated, but it affects some of the assumptions that were made about my ability to support myself." I kept my voice calm, businesslike, the tone of someone discussing practical matters rather than emotional devastation. It was the same tone he had used with me, and I was learning that it could be quite effective. I don't understand. You will when you see the paperwork. I should have everything sorted out within the next week or two. I hung up before he could ask more questions, leaving him with just enough information to be curious, and not nearly enough to understand what was actually happening. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was something better. It was the calm satisfaction of knowing that I was no longer at the mercy of his decisions, his timeline, his casual cruelty. For the first time in months, I was the one with information he needed, and I was in no hurry to share it. The paperwork arrived at Lucas's house on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail that required his signature. I knew this because I had specifically requested that delivery method, wanting to ensure he couldn't claim he had never received the documents that would change everything he thought he knew about his discarded mother. I was sitting in Carmen Rodriguez's office. Elena's daughter had offered me the administrative position after a 20-minute interview that felt more like a conversation between old friends, when my phone rang with Lucas's number. "What the hell is this?" he said without preamble, his voice tight with the kind of controlled anger that meant he was trying not to lose his temper while Maria was within earshot. "Legal documents," I replied calmly, continuing to organize the filing system Carmen had asked me to update. "As I mentioned when I called, this says you own property worth $250,000. That's impossible. You've never owned anything except—" He stopped abruptly, and I could practically hear him recalculating everything he thought he knew about my financial situation. "Except what, Lucas? Except what you've allowed me to own?" The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of assumptions that were crumbling in real time. "Why didn't you tell me about this house?" he asked finally, his voice different now, less angry, more uncertain. "The same reason you didn't tell me you had stopped paying the mortgage on our house 3 months before you evicted me," I said evenly. "Some information is shared on a need-to-know basis." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I interrupted, using the firm tone I had perfected during his teenage years when he tried to negotiate his way out of consequences. "I understand perfectly. You made your position very clear. I'm simply responding accordingly. Where are you staying? We should talk about this in person." We. As if Maria would be included in a conversation about my life and choices. As if I needed to justify my decisions to the woman who had measured my bedroom for nursery furniture before I had finished packing my belongings. "I'm staying somewhere appropriate for someone in my situation," I said, deliberately echoing Maria's words from that horrible day. "Somewhere more suitable for someone who needs to find her own path. Look, maybe we were hasty. Maybe you were exactly as deliberate as you intended to be," I said. "Maybe you got exactly what you wanted. A house to yourselves, a nursery without interference, a life without the burden of including someone whose contributions you had reclassified as gifts." I could hear Maria's voice in the background, asking questions he wasn't answering. "The thing is, Lucas," I continued, "I've had some time to think during these past 2 weeks. Time to remember who I was before I became someone whose worth was determined by your convenience." "That's not— I never said you weren't worth—" "You didn't need to say it. You demonstrated it quite clearly." Carmen looked up from her desk, eyebrows raised with curiosity, but too polite to eavesdrop obviously. I gave her an apologetic smile and stepped into the hallway for privacy. "I want to come see you," Lucas said, and for the first time since this conversation began, he sounded like the child I remembered rather than the stranger who had evicted me. "We need to talk properly." "About what?" "About how you need to recalculate the financial arrangements you made without consulting me? About how someone you assumed was destitute might actually have options you didn't account for? About how we can fix this. Fix this." As if my homelessness had been a technical problem rather than a deliberate choice he had made. "There's nothing to fix, Lucas. You solved your problem exactly as you intended. You got the space you needed, the independence you wanted, the life you felt you deserved. Congratulations. You're my mother," he said, and I heard something that might have been desperation creeping into his voice. "Yes," I agreed. "I am. I'm the woman who gave up her education so you could have yours. I'm the woman who worked 3 jobs so you could focus on your studies. I'm the woman who contributed $30,000 to the down payment on your house. Not as a gift, but as an investment in what I foolishly believed was our shared future. We can pay you back. With what money, Lucas? You just told me 2 weeks ago that you barely had enough to cover the mortgage without my contributions. Have you suddenly received a raise that makes repaying me possible? Silence. Or are you thinking of taking out a loan against the house? The house that you've been building equity in with my money for 5 years? The house you assured me I had no legal claim to? We could work something out. We could have worked something out 2 weeks ago, before you handed me an eviction notice. We could have worked something out any time during the past 8 months while you and Maria planned my removal. We could have worked something out during any of the conversations where you dismissed my contributions as gifts I had freely chosen to give. I was standing in the hallway of Carmen's office building, looking out at a parking lot where normal people came and went from normal jobs, living normal lives that didn't include having their children throw them away like unwanted furniture. The Hendersons are lovely people, I said, changing the subject with the same casual indifference Lucas had shown when discussing my displacement. They've been renting my mother's house for 3 years. They want to buy it. Your mother's house? I thought she sold that years ago to pay medical bills. She told you that because she didn't want you to feel obligated to help manage a rental property when you already had so much on your plate with college and starting your career. She was protecting you from additional responsibility. The irony hung in the air between us. My mother had kept secrets to protect Lucas from burden, while he had kept secrets to burden me with homelessness. How much is it worth? He asked. And I heard the exact moment when grief and regret transformed back into calculation. Enough, I said simply. Mom, listen, I know things got complicated, but we're family. We can figure this out together. Family. The word felt foreign coming from him, like a language he had forgotten how to speak fluently. Lucas, I said gently, do you remember what you told me when I asked where I was supposed to go? I was upset. I wasn't thinking clearly. You told me it wasn't your problem anymore. You were very clear about that. I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said. And you were right. My housing situation, my financial security, my future, none of that is your problem. Just like your mortgage payments, your relationship drama, and your need for space aren't my problems anymore. I could hear Maria in the background again, her voice more urgent now. She wants to know if you're going to help with the mortgage, I said, reading the situation with the clarity that comes from no longer having emotional investment in the outcome. That's not, how did you? Because that's what this call is really about, isn't it? You're not worried about me. You're worried about whether you can afford the house without my contributions. You're worried about whether your pregnant girlfriend will leave you if you can't maintain the lifestyle she's become accustomed to. The silence was answer enough. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm but final. I'm going to sell my mother's house to the Hendersons, who will appreciate it the way it deserves to be appreciated. I'm going to use that money to build a life that belongs entirely to me. And you're going to figure out how to be the independent adult you claimed you wanted to become. Wait, I'm not angry with you, Lucas. I'm disappointed, but I'm not angry. Anger would suggest I still had expectations, and I've learned to stop expecting things from people who have made it clear they consider my expectations unreasonable. I could hear him breathing, but he didn't speak. Goodbye, son. I hope you find whatever it was you thought you needed when you decided I was too much trouble to keep around. I hung up before he could respond, standing in that ordinary hallway feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the profound satisfaction of being the one who walked away. 6 months later, I was standing in my mother's kitchen, my kitchen now, watching the Hendersons' children play in the backyard that had once been mine, feeling a peace I hadn't known was possible. The sale had closed 3 weeks ago, and I had used the money exactly as I had promised myself I would, to build a life that belonged entirely to me. The apartment I had chosen was small but perfect, a 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors nodded when they saw me tending my container garden on the balcony, where the local coffee shop knew I preferred my morning tea with honey, where I existed as Alessandra Morrison rather than as someone's discarded mother. Carmen's business had grown enough that my position had evolved from administrative support to office manager, a title that came with both increased responsibility and a salary that made me feel competent rather than grateful. I had discovered that decades of managing a household and a child's complex schedule had prepared me well for managing client communications and project timelines. More importantly, I had rediscovered the woman I had been before I became defined entirely by my relationship to someone else's needs. I was reading when the doorbell rang that Saturday afternoon, curled in the armchair I had bought specifically because I loved its soft gray fabric and the way the afternoon light fell across it when I positioned it by the window. The book was one I had wanted to read for years, but had never found time for when my evenings were consumed by other people's laundry and meal planning. Lucas stood in my hallway looking older than his 28 years, his usual confidence replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. He was holding a small gift bag and wearing the expression of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say, but wasn't sure his rehearsal had been adequate. "Hello, Lucas," I said, neither welcoming nor dismissive. He was a person standing at my door, and I would treat him with the courtesy I would show any unexpected visitor. "Hi, Mom." The word came out carefully, as if he wasn't sure he still had the right to use it. Could we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in, noticing how his eyes moved around my apartment with what appeared to be surprise. Perhaps he had expected to find me living in the kind of desperate circumstances that would justify his abandonment. Instead, he found a space that was clearly chosen rather than settled for, decorated with care rather than assembled from necessity. "This is nice," he said, and I heard genuine appreciation in his voice, rather than the patronizing tone he had used when commenting on my choices during the final months I had lived in his house. "Thank you," I said, settling back into my chair while he remained standing in the middle of my living room. "Would you like some tea?" "Yes, please." I prepared tea with the same deliberate attention I brought to everything in my life now, choosing my favorite cups rather than whatever was convenient, taking time to arrange everything properly on a tray. When I returned to the living room, Lucas was studying the photographs I had hung on the wall, pictures of him at various ages, mixed with photos of my parents, my new coworkers, the small social life I had begun building. "You kept pictures of me," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been relief. "Of course I did. You're my son. That hasn't changed. Even after you made it clear that my worth to you was conditional on my usefulness," I said matter-of-factly, pouring tea into both cups. "My love for you was never conditional on your behavior, Lucas. That's the difference between us." He sat down heavily on my couch, the gift bag still clutched in his hands. "I brought you something," he said, offering the bag with the hesitant gesture of someone who wasn't sure their gift would be welcome. Inside was a framed photograph, the picture I had treasured of 7-year-old Lucas holding up his Mother's Day drawing, the one that had been in the cardboard box I carried to the motel. The frame was expensive, silver with an elegant design that someone had put thought into choosing. "I found it when we were going through your things," he said quietly. I realized you didn't take very much with you, just a few photos and some clothes. You left behind almost everything you owned." "I took what mattered," I said, accepting the framed photograph and placing it on the side table next to my chair, "and I left behind what belonged to a life I was no longer welcome in." "You were welcome." "No, Lucas, I wasn't. You made that very clear." He stared at his hands, and I saw something in his posture that reminded me of the child he had been when he was struggling to understand a difficult concept in school. "Maria left," he said finally. I waited for him to continue, sipping my tea and giving him the space to explain whatever he had come to tell me. "About 2 months ago, she said I was too dependent on other people, that I needed to learn to handle my own problems instead of expecting everyone else to solve them for me." He looked up at me with the expression that might have been ironic. "She said I had never learned to appreciate what I had because I'd never had to work for anything myself." I nodded, unsurprised. Maria had been attracted to the lifestyle Lucas could provide, not to Lucas himself. When that lifestyle became less secure, her interest had predictably waned. "I couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments," he continued. "Without your contributions, without the rental income from having a tenant, the house was more than I could afford on my own. I had to sell it." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Not because I wished I could have prevented it, but because I recognized that losing a home was painful regardless of the circumstances that caused it. "The thing is," he said, his voice growing quieter. When I was packing up the house, going through all the papers and documents, I found things. Records of everything you had contributed over the years. Not just the down payment, but utilities, repairs, improvements. You had paid for a lot more than I remembered. More than you chose to remember, I corrected gently. Yes, he admitted. More than I chose to remember. We sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon light shifting across my apartment with the passage of time. I also found the letter, he said. The one your mother left explaining about the house. She talked about you in it, about how much you had sacrificed for me, about how worried she was that I took your devotion for granted. She was a wise woman. She was right to be worried. He set down his teacup and looked directly at me for the first time since he had arrived. I did take you for granted. I convinced myself that your contributions were freely given gifts rather than investments in our shared life. I told myself that you were depending on me instead of recognizing that I was depending on you. The admission hung in the air between us, honest and painful, and years overdue. I was angry, he continued. Angry about having to be responsible for you. Angry about Maria's complaints. Angry about feeling like I couldn't have the life I wanted because I had obligations I hadn't asked for. But the truth is, I hadn't asked for most of the things you gave me either. Your sacrifices, your support, your love. I hadn't earned any of it. It was just there, so constant that I stopped seeing it. And when you stopped seeing it, it became easy to dismiss it, I said. Yes. I looked at this man, my son, the child I had raised, the adult he had chosen to become, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied that injury had been repaired rather than simply acknowledged, but something like acceptance. Acceptance that he was capable of recognizing his failures even if he couldn't undo their consequences. Lucas, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry with you anymore, but that doesn't mean things can go back to the way they were. I've built a life that works for me. A life where my worth isn't determined by someone else's convenience. I won't give that up. I'm not asking you to, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I believe you are sorry, I said. And I believe you understand better now than you did 6 months ago. But understanding and regretting aren't the same as making amends. What would making amends look like? The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than the calculating tone he had used when discussing my contributions during our last conversation in his house. It would look like you becoming the kind of person who doesn't need his mother to be homeless before he recognizes her value, I said. It would look like you learning to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than unilateral dependence. It would look like you never again treating anyone's love as something you're entitled to rather than something you're grateful to receive. I don't know how to do that, he said quietly. Then you learn, the same way I learned how to live without defining myself through my relationship to you. The same way I learned that I could be valued for who I am rather than what I could provide. Growth is possible, Lucas, but it requires you to acknowledge that your current approach to relationships is inadequate. He nodded, and I saw something in his expression that reminded me why I had loved him so fiercely for so many years. Vulnerability, coupled with genuine desire to become better than he was. Could we... He began, then stopped. Would it be possible for us to have some kind of relationship? Not like before, but something new? I considered the question seriously, looking at this young man who had caused me such profound pain, but who was also the person I had spent 26 years learning to love. Perhaps, I said finally, but it would have to be a relationship between equals, between two adults who choose to include each other in their lives, rather than one person depending on another's inexhaustible devotion. I'd like that, he said. I'd like to learn how to be someone worthy of choosing. As he prepared to leave, I walked him to the door and stood watching as he got into his car. A smaller, older model than the one he had driven me to the motel in 6 months earlier. Before he drove away, he rolled down his window. Mom? He called. I'm proud of you. For building this life. For not letting what I did break you. You deserved better than what I gave you. And I'm glad you found it. I watched him drive away, then returned to my apartment, to my chair, to my book, to the life I had constructed from the ashes of the one that had been destroyed. The afternoon light was fading, but there was something warm and golden about the way it filled my space, illuminating the photographs and books and small treasures that belonged entirely to me. I had learned something important in these months of reconstruction. Dignity isn't something other people give you or take away from you. It's something you claim for yourself, something you protect through the choices you make about who you become and how you respond when the world tests your resolve. I was Alessandra Morrison, and I was enough. I had always been enough. It had just taken losing everything to remember that truth.